Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. So, before we get started in today's program with the ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine, I had a conversation yesterday with, let's just call him a Generation Z type of person, early 20s. I would define this person as a low information voter. Now, not all of Generation Z, people in their early 20s, are low information urbanites, voters. Many are. The vast majority at this point in our country, the United States, are what I would define as low information voters, meaning they have very little knowledge of what's happening around them in the world outside of popular culture. They know a great deal about popular culture, but outside of that very small sphere, they know very little. Politics, governance, geopolitical issues, military and foreign affairs, very little. So in this conversation that I was having, he was aware that I was very interested and have had other conversations with persons about international affairs and in local and national politics. And he asked me the question, with Russia, why don't we level them? And I was kind of taken aback. He said, why don't we just level them? And I said, what do you mean by level them? Just take them out. Just bomb them, level them. And then I said, oh, you mean like go to war with Russia? Yeah, exactly. Just level them. I mean, they don't have much, do they? And I was, it doesn't surprise me. And I don't think it surprises many of the listeners to this program. But that is what he felt and what he believed the capability of the United States was. And you got to understand, most, again, of these Generation Zers, even the generation after that, the newest generation, what is it called? Somebody help me out here in the comments section. They are living in what I would call societal apogee, the pinnacle of what they believe is civilization. They want for very little. Anything that they want is just a iPhone click away from being delivered to their home within about 20 minutes. Anything they want. Click, click, click. And that gives them the ability to focus on what entertains them. And that's popular culture. So that's how you get the comment, why don't we just level them, the Russian Federation? Then I asked, hey, where do you live? And he explained where he lived. And I realized that he was very close to a very important U.S. military installation. A military installation that, in all probability, if global war were to break out between the United States and Russia, would be targeted by a Russian nuclear ballistic missile attack. And I then began to explain to this individual that, hey, in all probability, based on where you're telling me you live, there will be 3 to 9 independently guided thermal nuclear warheads with essentially a 100 megaton warhead on each of these reentry vehicles that is going to detonate very near to your home. And in all probability, you will then die upon initiating hostilities against Russia. In terms of what you just said of why don't we just level Russia? And his response was, well, don't we have the ability to shoot all their missiles down? Can't we just shoot their missiles down? Yeah, we could shoot some of their missiles down. But we're not going to shoot all of their missiles down. And some nuclear weapons are going to get through. And that's going to degrade the United States' ability to further defend itself from further inbound nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles. But again, really no concept in terms of what could happen if, quote-unquote, World War III were to start. No concept at all. In many of these voting age individuals in Generation Z and thereafter, even millennials, have no concept of what could happen. No concept at all. So that goes back to my original question from previous videos. Voting. Is it a right or is it a privilege? Should it be more of a privilege? Should you have to demonstrate some sort of mental capacity in order to vote? Most of you are probably well aware of how voting is done now in the United States. It can essentially be done remotely via the mail. So more and more seriously mentally handicapped individuals are now voting. Or those persons who take care of those persons who are seriously mentally handicapped are voting for that person. So should a serious case of Down syndrome be able to vote? Right now, that's a yes. So I'd love to hear in the comment section. Voting, a right or a privilege? A right or a privilege? Now, back to the program, back to the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has launched within the last 24 hours a series of cruise missile and ballistic missile attacks. More than 40 ballistic and cruise missiles were launched at various aim points throughout Ukraine. The Ukrainian military is claiming that they have shot down 50% of the inbound cruise missiles and ballistic missiles that were targeting Ukrainian forces. Now, that hit ratio that Ukraine is now claiming, 50%. Previously, the Ukrainians were claiming upwards to 90 to 100% of inbound Russian missiles were being intercepted by the Ukrainian Air Defense Network. So is this a sign of the Ukrainians losing air defense capability, or is it a sign that the Ukrainians are being a little bit more transparent in their reporting of these ongoing cruise missile and ballistic missile strikes? Difficult to say. But of the 20 or so aim points that were hit, the Ukrainians only report a handful of civilian casualties. A handful of civilian casualties. I think maybe five people. Now, if 21 cruise missiles with 1,000-pound warheads were to hit civilian areas, were to hit large apartment blocks, the casualty rates for civilians would be much higher. If Russia launched 20 of those missiles, and they were designed to hit civilian areas. You would not see 5 people deceased. You would see many, many more. So that tells us that those 21 aim points, that those targets that the Russians hit, in all probability were military targets. And in all probability, those military targets were struck. But the Ukrainians do not report military casualties. So you can only wonder what targets were hit and what the losses looked like. The Rondelli Foundation map here that we're looking at now is finally reporting that, or actually showing on their map, the Russian breakthrough that occurred southeast of Avdiivka. Russian forces, Russian infantry, are now combing through and conducting clearing operations in the southeastern quadrant of Avdiivka. These are single-family homes that is now the battle space. The area, if we zoom in on the map, you can see these heavily fortified areas were broken through by Russian forces. You can see here the large trench works. And then you can see clearly that the Russian forces have pushed past many of these fortifications and again are now inside Avdiivka itself. So how much longer is this going to take for the Russians to finally capture Avdiivka? Are they going to capture Avdiivka? In all probability, they will. Again, this is a very slow, methodical operation, and ultimately the most difficult nut for the Russians to crack is going to be these old Soviet-style multi-dwelling units, these old Soviet apartment blocks in the central western sector of Avdiivka. And again, I've talked about before, these are all interconnected by tunnels, by underground tunnels and basements and bomb shelters and what have you. So it will be, if the Ukrainians decide to try and stay and fight, it will be a long and difficult urban struggle. Now, it looks like the Russians are going to continue both operations in the south, but at the same time are looking to cut Ukrainian forces off from additional supplies and resources being provided to Avdiivka through a complete encirclement. Now look, the Russians are not going to have to completely encircle Avdiivka in order to completely cut off all supplies going into Avdiivka. They have now fire control over all the westerly entrances to Avdiivka. And again, that's making it very challenging for the Ukrainian military to continue to supply its forces. Now, there has been an article in the via the Military Balance, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. They have written an article that claims that the Russian military, its confidence in a lot of their equipment has been decreased by the ongoing war with Ukraine, especially in terms of dealing with U.S. and Western European air defense systems. The Russian tanks, the T-72 Bravo 3, all variants of the T-72, T-90, the BMP-2, the BMP-3, the ISSS is claiming, again, that the Russian high command, the Russian political leadership, confidence in a lot of this equipment has been essentially shattered by this ongoing war. Now, I would contend that that confidence in some of this equipment, such as the T-72, that confidence had to have been shaken even prior to the ongoing war with Ukraine. Now, the only real option for the Russians to enhance some of this equipment, especially many of these main battle tanks, is to eliminate the autoloader, the ammunition carousel that sits underneath the turret. And that's one of the biggest issues that cause some of these catastrophic explosions. The separation of the crew compartment from the ammunition compartment. Now, obviously, that's not done. The BMP-2, same situation. But again, many of these systems are much lighter and much less armored than Western armored vehicles. So the Russians would have to, one, radically change designs. Two, they would also have to increase the weight of many of these armored vehicles. Both infantry fighting vehicles, look, the Bradley is much heavier than the BMP-2. Much heavier armored. It's bigger. And the same with the T-72 and the T-80 and the T-90. They would have to increase probably these vehicles by about 10 tons, if not more. And that's why these Western armored vehicles, at least in terms of the frontal aspect hits, have been more survivable. The M1 Abrams is pushing 70 tons. Much more heavier vehicle than a T-72 that's operating in that 40-ton space. Now, one of the main reasons the Russians do not increase the weight of a lot of these vehicles and put more armor on them is because of the rail networks and the bridge networks around the country. These vehicles would be too heavy for those bridges. The Russians also learned during World War II that 65 and 70-ton Tiger and Tiger II main battle tanks, even the Panther to a lesser extent, did not always do well in the marshy environments of areas such as eastern Ukraine and southern Belarus. So that's why they have not done that. Now, has that confidence been shaken? I would say yes, in terms of individual soldiers operating some of this equipment. But what has probably not been shaken in terms of confidence, and I would argue this, is grand strategy. There's a reason why, in terms of grand strategy, the Russians continue to make these types of armored vehicles. And just the cost prohibitive issue of creating another armored vehicle and then starting production. The Russians are now masters of producing these variants, T-72s, BMP-2s, T-80s, T-90s. So they're going to do all they can to continue to upgrade these existing vehicles and at the same time give themselves the battlefield edge the battlefield production edge in terms of being able to produce a lot of these vehicles very quickly. And yeah, it goes back to quantity has a quality all its own. And a simplistic system that can be manufactured very quickly, and a three-person crew can learn to fight in that vehicle very quickly and maintain that vehicle very quickly, does have an advantage. We know it's very difficult for the Ukrainians to repair a lot of these Western systems. In fact, they have to be sent back to areas close to the EU to get a lot of these systems repaired. The Russians can do this with mobile repair factories that are being set up closer to the Ukrainian-Russian border. So tactically, yes, I would say confidence has been shaken at the crew level. As a former tanker, I would not want to operate a T-72. I've been in T-72s, and it is not a vehicle I personally would want to go to war in. But in terms of grand strategy, being able to manufacture lots of these systems and deploy lots of these systems as a strategic warfighter, I would have to rethink deploying that system. Meaning I would probably go with it. What do you think? Let's hear it in the comment section. So that's all we have for today. Thanks for joining us. More to come very, very soon. As always, have a good day.